we've installed our package or our nuke. And at this point in the year, we're still in primarily one hive body for the people that are just starting this year. Out on the outside of the frames throughout the spring, we're gonna start to see some of that water-like substance, which is gonna be wet nectar, okay, which is 80% water, 20% sucrose, table sugar. Maybe we'll start to see some different color pollen pellets from the pollen that they're bringing in. We should start to see a solid brood nest where our queen isn't laying what I would call shotgun brood and very spotty brood cycles. We should start to see a nice half moon-like brood pattern. We're gonna start to see a lot of different things. I went over a little bit of what we'll start to see on some of the frames, but it's important that we understand why what is happening in the colony is happening. So in the spring, we've got a heavy dose of nectar and pollen that are coming into the beehive, okay? So humans, for example, we have 3 parts to our diet. We consume fats, we consume proteins, and we consume carbohydrates, okay? We consume fats, proteins, and carbohydrates from birth all the way until death. There's no part of our lives at any time where we stay away from proteins or carbs. It's just not something that our body needs. Likewise, our sugar, our wet nectar, that's going to act as our carbs. And eventually our wet nectar that's coming into the hive at 80% moisture and 20% sugar is going to get dehydrated and fanned down to about 18% moisture. It'll get capped, and that will be what we know as honey. Pollen, on the other hand, bees forage and get pollen, but pollen out in the flowers or trees that they're consuming is not in its digestible state at that time. So bees go out, they come in, and we've all been keeping bees here, and we've definitely seen the pollen sacs coming in on bees, right? And then they're walking around. It's really amazing. And that's fresh pollen that they're literally bringing into that hive right there. That pollen is going to get broken up into pellets and stored in a cell. And through saliva and different processes that the nurse bees go through, they'll turn that pollen into what we call bee bread. At that time, bee bread is then digestible for the honey. Pollen patty essentially is a supplement for bee bread, okay? And this is, pollen patty is ready to eat in a digestible form that would be inserted right directly into the hives. But before we get into that, so pollen comes in and the queen is laying eggs and the nurse bees feed the brood and the larva bee bread. Brood and nurse bees only consume protein. It's not until a bee turns into an adult bee, a guard, a worker bee, that it will consume only carbohydrates. And the reason that that's important is because, like I said earlier, we consume them all the time. But the name of the game is to have the most bees possible in the hive. A big beehive fights off diseases better. A big beehive gives you more options to split from. A big beehive can defend itself against robbing. A big beehive is less likely to suffer from hive beetle issues, right? A big beehive is more likely to pull itself through what we would call a dearth period, where there's a lack of pollen or nectar, right? You never hear anyone say, our goal is to have a little beehive, right? So if our goal is to have a big beehive, then our goal has to be to keep the brood population increasing. So during the spring, we see that happen because of pollen that is coming in, because pollen acts as protein for the baby bees, and a reaction goes off in the hive. The queen sees that her bed is being made and drawn out from wax that is being secreted by the bees as they're consuming nectar. Checkbox. Pollen is coming in at a fast rate. There's plenty of food for all the babies I'm gonna lay. Checkbox. If the queen, like the good mom that she is, she will not lay more eggs than the food in the hive can support. That's why we see a decrease at a brood laying rate, and that's because of a lack of pollen that's coming into the hive. We see our hive start to grow in the spring because we've got an abundant source of nectar and pollen coming in. In Florida, particularly, our spring is going to start earlier than a lot of the books that we read are going to say, right? Because spring really starts here, like in February, right? We'll start getting the maple bloom. The flowers start coming out at Lowe's and Home Depot, right? February is really our spring, where you hear in a lot of different books and literature that we read, you'll hear March, April. Well, if we as beekeepers are going off of that information, we're going to be behind 6 weeks, and we're going to have problems, right? So we'll start getting that dose of maple in February. Might get some of that citrus depending on where you guys are located. Maybe some palmetto, some gallberry, different things, some wildflower. That's what we're going to start to see. And our hope is that as we come into June, and we're by mid-June, that our single deep hive body is built out and ready for a next box or our summer options from there, okay? If your bees are not there, you gotta feed them. This is a 1 gallon pro feeder. These are the feeders that I use particularly. Because they're accessible, right? So they go right in the inside of the box, and that's gonna hold 1 gallon, and my bees can consume that within a week or sooner. And a lot of times we're not really aware. No one says, feed your bees X amount, because they're all different. They're like kids, right? I could be looking at some of my kids and they're right next to each other and they're completely different. And I could be looking at 2 beehives right next to each other and 2 things are happening that are different. So the easiest way to remember about feeding is the bees, they will tell you. They'll tell you. I always tell people, feed them, feed them, feed them. Keep feed on your bees until you notice they're not touching it anymore. They will tell you we're getting natural nectar from nature, so we don't need the substitute anymore, and they won't touch it. As long as they are consuming it, they are telling you we need it. It is that simple, okay? So if your bees are not progressing, it's due to a lack of feed, more than likely. This gentleman asked was his new bees, they have equipment that's basically brand new, okay? This is what we call foundation. Just think about it like when we're building a house. We've got the foundation to the home, and the home gets built on it. That's the same thing with the beehive, okay? So you've noticed, while you've been keeping bees, that they're consuming that sugar water at an almost, you would think, an alarming rate. They're, right. And you remember what I had just said here, that as long as they take it, they're telling you we need it. And the reason that that is the case is because they have no drawn comb. So the amount of work that a beehive puts in will always be the most on a brand new hive. Remember, the queen can't lay until this is drawn. Nothing can get stored until this is drawn. So in order for that colony, they're on a timer throughout nature. In order for them to get those things accomplished to sustain the colony, they got to draw wax. And that's going to happen from a gland. They're going to secrete wax based on the nectar flow, okay? Or sugar water that you're supplementing.